Ken. Our next speaker is Darren De Bortli. Darren we actually sampled some of his wines last night. They're pretty good, I'm going to say.
Thanks to speak up for giving me the opportunity to talk here. I've got a Facebook page called Murray-Darling Basin Myths, and that's full of plenty of technical references and whatever. And I set it up, and I've had plenty of arguments on it. My theories have been tested, and in the process of debate, I've learnt a lot about the actual system. Amazingly so, from actually opponents which provide information on investigation that actually supported what I was saying. And what I'm about to say is the Coorong, and you've got to remember, when we talk about these environmental flows, what was the major driver of these environmental flows? 2011, and Professor Richard Kingsford, it was all about the Coorong. So we need Murray-Darling Basin water to go into the lower lakes, then to feed into the Coorong, and to sustain the Coorong as a freshwater system. There was only one problem with that. The Coorong got its water from the opposite direction. And in 1860, and this started back in 1860 when they started digging drains, and why they dug drains was because 40% of the lower southeast of South Australia was wetland. So in middle of winter and spring it was all full of water, and then come summer and autumn and they were dry. But the thing is, with the lower southeast, what happened is, as the sea retreated thousands of years ago, what it did was create a series of old Coorongs. And as that Coorong formed, then the sea would drop, and then another Coorong would form at lower levels, and that would drop. So you've got these several Coorongs all at lower level, all dropping towards the west. So and there was a volcanic eruption around Mount Gambier, the Blue Lakes, and that was a volcanic eruption which tilted the land towards the north. So the flows from all that region, which was always towards the to the northwest. So you had these series of old Coorongs all directing the water towards the not only the Coorong but amazingly so to the lower lakes. So you had overland flows during these wet periods flowing not only into Lake Albert and Lake Alexandrina from the south, but you also had significant flows going into the Coorong. Now the problem with the debate, what had happened is over the period of years, and we're starting in 1860, so in 1860 Goyder was asked to comment about all the soggy land around Kingston, and his recommendation was to extend the natural Marie Creek drain, which only extended about 3 miles. So they did work and they extended that drain to drain some of that land. Now, why this is important, because when you go back to about 1864 they did that. Now, what was important was how much water actually flowed down the Coorong. Now, I came up with a figure of 4,000 gigalitres of flows. I said it was Coorong, but obviously I was wrong, because some of that water actually flowed directly towards the lower lakes. Now, how much water actually flowed in the Coorong? Well, the problem you've really got to go back to pre-1880s, because what happened in 1880, they did what they called the major extension of the Marie Creek drain, which cut across that most westerly, lowest wetland. And that Marie Creek drain basically removed the wetland that fed directly into the Coorong. Now, how much water actually flowed into the Coorong during that period? Well, I can tell you now, 1860s, they were talking about making the Coorong navigable. And one of the suggestions was to extend the Marie Creek drain into the Coorong. There's about an 8-foot fall from that region down towards the lower lakes, and they were talking about extending the drain. Now, there was a series of arguments about whether that was feasible or not, and we know that certainly during this period there was talk of being able to take boats in those wet years all the way overland from the lower lakes all the way to Millicent, or to Mount Muirhead in Millicent. Now, to do that just gives you an idea of the volumes of water that we're talking about. Now, anyhow, one of the reports talked about, looking at the feasibility of doing this work, was talked about the various levels of the lower of the Coorong, and it's got to be remembered that during the wet periods, it was very wet. There's lots of water that flowed north, and during the summer and autumn, all that wetlands were dry. Now, this report talked about the various levels during the wetter period, and it's quite interesting that they talked about 16 kilometres south of Salt Creek,
that the water level in the Coorong was 2.5 to 3 feet deep. Now the Coorong is something like 1.5 kilometres wide at that period. Now we know, certainly I've had discussions, but and it could be confirmed by the hydrologists, but we know that the freshwater diatom record requires a flow rate of greater than 0.2 metres per second. So you start doing the rough numbers, you're talking about 17 gigalitres a day of freshwater flows coming from the south during this wet period. And then the sun would come, that would drop off, you'd be left with these series of salt lagoons, which the height would be regulated basically by the estuarine interface all the way back to the lower lakes and the Murray and the Murray mouth. So when you start thinking of 17 gigalitres a day roughly, and like I said, that whatever the figure is, it was a lot of water, and that's not disputable. And then when summer came, we had groundwater flows flowing into the Coorong from these formations known as tufa, limestone pipes, literally coming up from the ground. Professor Bittergel fell off one, he reckons, a couple of feet tall. They're quite amazing structures. Now they haven't been in operation for a long time. Now it's quite obvious they provide a lot of groundwater flows into the Coorong. And what this is important is when they built those barrages in 1940, they directed those flows directly to the Murray mouth. That is the reason why the Murray mouth never closed over from 1940 till 1982, when there's no longer enough flows going into the Coorong to keep it open. The flows kept on dropping. 30 years ago, listed under Ramsar as a reverse estuarine and the lower lakes of elevated freshwater system. But as the flows kept on dropping off the Coorong, they had to push more and more exponential water to keep the Murray mouth open because the flows have been completely distorted. Now, so when you talk about environmental flows, the only record I can find that talks about the reason for it is Professor David Payton talking about the requirement for at least 4,000 gigalitres of water to maintain the Coorong as a degraded system, because it's dying, from flows from the Murray-Darling Basin. The whole thing is, the whole science and the whole premise of this is based on fraud or poor science, because it's definitely been political manipulation. And you can talk about to Ken Jury about when they were doing the beacon work, monitoring the seawater pushing in against very large flood-like flows. They were monitoring the sea pushing in with a southwesterly and a high tide. And interesting enough, the government, and it'll confirm this, I hope, and the government decommissioned 8 beacons closest to the barrage. So it's quite clear to me the whole thing's been, the science was being manipulated by the South Australian government. I think that's, I can talk for hours if you like.